We had already gone through example 1. We had already started example 2. We didn't get all the way through it. We were looking at the box and whisker plots and how those can describe the distributions or show a distribution. So I know that we had already yesterday typed in this information into the calculators, and then we had graphed the box and whisker plot and identified that it was symmetric. But what I do want to start with, and we're going to have to retype this in, we're going to have to type this in again into the calculators so that we can answer part B based on the symmetric distribution. What measures of center and spread should we be finding, and then how to find that on the calculator before we move on to example 3, which is actually comparing 2 different distributions. So I'll review with you on your calculators, and then parts of example 3 and example 4 I'm actually just going to leave you to kind of work through and just see what you're picking up on if you know how to navigate the calculator to be able to do this, and I'll walk around and help. So as we type this in, make sure you understand what keys to press, where to go, because I might have you do that for example 3, see what you remember without me leading you through it. So again, just as a recap, in this example, in this table here, we have students in Mr. Vigi's language arts class found the average number of minutes that they spent each night on homework. So in order to enter this into the calculator as a review, make sure your calculator turns on. They all should. I think there's still one floating out there that might give the message that the batteries are low. So if your calculator dies, please let me know. But just as a review, where you need to go. You go to enter a list of values in your calculator. You go to the stat key. So again, third column, second one down. It's kind of kitty corner from that left arrow. Hit stat to get this screen. You want option 1 that's already highlighted. You want to edit a list. So you just click enter. And now this actually might be done for some of you based on where my 5th hour yesterday left off, but I'm going to end up clearing mine. If you have something in this list, because it might actually be this list, it might not be. The person who had the calculator before you might not have entered everything exactly the way they should have, so I would recommend clearing it and just re-entering it to make sure. But again, to clear a list, or if you have multiple, you arrow up to highlight the list name, hit the clear button, and then hit enter to clear the entire thing. So don't delete them individually, just clear the entire thing. And then to enter them in, you just type in each number, hit enter, and you'll see it's added to the list. Were they entered in already?
Yeah, she erased them.
Well, and like I said, they might have been entered in from 5th hour yesterday, but you can't guarantee that that person entered them in correctly either, so. You don't want to go off of what someone else had and find out that it was wrong. And then there are 24 values in this table, so you should see your list name with a 25 after it. That means you've already entered 24 in there. So we don't need to re-graph the box and whisker plot. We just need the values in there so we can get the statistics. As some of you are finishing up entering those, though, so this is something that you might need to know. Say I gave you a box and whisker plot and you identified this is a symmetric distribution. The next question then asks to describe the center and spread of the data, again using either the mean and standard deviation, which you would use both. Mean would be the center, standard deviation would be the spread. Or you would use the 5-number summary for both measures, where the median is the center, the min and max and the quartiles are the spread. So if it's a symmetric distribution, which measures should you be using? What measure of center, what measure of spread? If it's a symmetric distribution. Yep, the mean would be the center, standard deviation would be the spread. So mean and standard deviation if it's symmetric, 5-number summary if it's skewed. So I would say here, since the distribution is symmetric, use the mean and standard deviation. So again, it does say to justify your choice, the justification for which measures you're using comes from what distribution you have. And then we use the calculator to actually find the mean and the standard deviation. We don't have to do that calculation by hand. So again, for how to get there, it's going to that same place we got the 5-number summary from for that first example. So from this list even, you want to go back to your stat key, so just hit stat. But to actually do the calculations, you want the calc menu that's along the top. So you want to arrow over to the right one, so you're under that calc menu. Option 1 is the one that you want, one variable stats. So you hit enter. And this is where the different calculators, you might get a different screen. So if you have a calculator, well, I guess if you did not get this screen, you should just be able to hit enter a second time. So if you have a black cover, you should be able to just hit enter a second time. There might be one calculator out there that doesn't work for. It just happened to somebody yesterday that didn't work. Otherwise, make sure if you get this screen, the list name that you see is the list you actually put your data into. So, for example, if you put your list into L3, this should say L3 instead of L1. And then you just do calculate, and this is what you should get. Anybody not able to get this screen? Did you go to stat already? So you go to stat, arrow over to the right once to be under calc, and then you want option 1, one variable stats. So you hit enter, make sure your list name is correct, and then you just arrow down to calculate and hit enter. Did it work? Okay. Okay, and then from here, here's where you have to identify, looking at this screen, what values are we writing down? So, in looking at this screen, what is the mean of the data set? Which one of those is the mean, or is it on the other screen? Because remember, you can arrow down to get more numbers. Yes, I think a couple of you said it is the 53.5. So the very first value you see, that X bar, that is the mean. And that is 53.5. So the average amount of time spent on homework each night would be 53.5. I could even put minutes after this. For this class, anyway, that's their average amount of time spent studying or spent on homework. And then the standard deviation, I'm just going to abbreviate this with SD. Now, standard deviation, and I did talk about this a little bit yesterday, you have to remember your calculator gives you 2 standard deviations. One is the standard deviation if the data you have is considered a sample. The other standard deviation is if the data you have is considered an entire population. So that's the SX, and then this O-looking symbol is actually sigma, the sigma X. So SX is if the data you have is just a sample, and then the sigma is if the data you have is a population, and I think that's why I included this here too. Yes, it says to recall. The formulas for standard deviation for a population and for a sample are slightly different. And even if you want to highlight that, because that has your notation on there as well. Population is the sigma, sample is the S. Because for this example, times for all of the students in Mr. Fuji's class are being analyzed, every student in his class, his 24 students, all of them gave their study times or their homework times. This would be considered the population. So it's not like only 5 students from his class listed their times, it was all 24. So we actually do have a population here. But again, if you want to highlight or kind of make a star or an arrow to that to understand that the data you have is a population, that's something you have to identify. Is the data I have a sample or a population? So we'd actually use the population standard deviation. So we're using the sigma. You don't have to put the x after it. The x is after it in here just to show x would be the variable. You can put it after it. You don't need to. And then I'm going to write it down, I'll say to 2 decimal places, so it would be about 10.46. And what that means, again, the standard deviation shows the spread. This is a little bit higher of a standard deviation. So on average, this is the number of minutes that the data values differ from the mean. So on average, it's kind of showing that they're spread out by this amount on average. So the lower that standard deviation is, that means the closer everybody's data is to one another. This shows their homework times are more spread out. Not everybody's spending a lot of time or a little bit of time. Okay, any questions on that? So it's kind of the same thing. It's being able to enter the data into the calculator, make either a histogram or a box and whisker plot to identify the distribution, and then based on the distribution, what measures should you be recording, and then giving those measures from the calculator. So example 3 is actually comparing 2 distributions. Examples 3 and 4 are comparing distributions. So it says at the top of that next page, when you're comparing 2 sets of data, this is in terms of if you should use the means and the standard deviations, or you should use the 5-number summaries. So you would use the means and the standard deviations only if both distributions are symmetric. However, if both distributions are skewed, or if one of them is symmetric but the other one is skewed, then you should be using the 5-number summaries. So you need to compare data using the same measures. You only use the means and the standard deviations if both are symmetric. If one or both are not symmetric, you would use the 5-number summaries. So in example 3, we have the attendance for a sample. I'm just going to highlight sample in case we have to use standard deviations. This is already telling us we have samples and not populations. So the attendance for a sample of the homeowners association meetings for 2 neighboring communities is shown. So we have the Chase Meadows community and the Eaton Estates community. And it says for part A to use a graphing calculator to construct a box and whisker plot for each set of data, and then sketch the graphs and describe the shape of each distribution. So I would like you actually to enter this data into your calculator. I do want to say though, because we have 2 sets of data, you're going to be using 2 of your lists. So I'm just going to clear this, we don't need it. So go back to your stat, hit the stat key, and then option 1 for edit, just hit enter. You can clear out your list 1. So again, highlight that list name, hit clear, enter to clear it out. So why don't you enter, and your list names might be different, that's okay. Enter Chase Meadows into the first list, and then when you're done with that, you'll just use the right arrow to arrow over and enter the Eaton Estates into the second list. So enter them both. And make sure when you're done, you should have the same number in each list. There should be 15 of each, so at the bottom it should say 16 to show that you already entered 15. But make sure you don't have one list that's longer than the other. They should have the same amount. Anybody not able to get both of their lists, or anybody having trouble with that? Okay, then we'll move on to actually making the box and whisker plots. So this will be a review of what we did yesterday, actually getting the box and whisker plots on our screen. So again, you want to go to that stat plot screen. So you hit the second key, second, and then y equals to get to the stat plot screen. And if we click enter for number 1, and this might actually already be set up for you, make sure plot 1 is still turned on. That should be from yesterday with the classes using the graphing calculators. This is also probably already set up for you under type. You want to make sure that first box and whisker plot in that second row, the first one is highlighted. If it isn't, you have to arrow down to type, and you have to use the right arrow to get over to that option. And then once you're hovering over it, click enter. And then because we have 2 lists, we actually are going to be using 2 different plots. So make sure for this one, again, this should already be set up. You have the name of your first list. So my first list was L1. For many of you, that was probably the same. I know there's at least a few calculators out there that are maybe different. Make sure that says L1. Frequency, again, doesn't matter. Mark doesn't matter. This is just if it has to mark an outlier, what it marks it as. Anybody have questions on this screen? That should be set up. Okay, then I want you to click second y equals again to get back to that stat plot screen. We're going to now turn on plot number 2. So arrow down to plot 2 or number 2 and click enter. Because we have to make 2 box and whisker plots. We can make them both at the same time. They can both appear on the same screen. So here, because mine and yours is probably also turned off, we want it turned on. So as it's hovering over on, click enter to highlight on. We want a second box and whisker plot. So under type, you may need to arrow over 3 times to get to this first box and whisker plot and hit enter to highlight that one. For the X list though, so my first one was list L1. I want my second one to be L2. So I'm going to arrow down where it says X list, and this is how you can change the name. And if yours is something different, like if your second list was actually L4, I know some calculators have different names. If you look above your keys 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, notice either in blue or in that orangish yellow, you should see L1, L2, L3, L4, L5, L6. So if I hit second and then the number 2, L2 appears instead. So change your list name. If you didn't already have L2 there, or if your second list was under something different and the name isn't correct, make sure you change that. Again, the frequency and the mark, those don't matter. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead, and then if there's issues, I can walk around and handle those individually. So again, on my calculator, on yours, maybe also I'm going to hit second mode to get back to my home screen before I try to graph this. Otherwise, it's not going to work out. You can just go to your y equals key. Don't hit second first, just go to y equals. And you should make sure that everything here is still cleared out, but you should see both plot 1 and plot 2 are turned on. They are both turned on. And then again, to get the best viewing screen, you want to go to zoom, that middle key of your top 5, go to zoom, and then you want option 9. for Zoom Stat. And you should see two box and whisker plots appear on the same screen. Anybody not get this, or does something look entirely different than what I have? Anybody else?
Yeah. Okay, you have to go on help. Yeah. Oh, I forgot.
Anybody else not get the box and whisker plots to work out? Okay, so then in looking at these two box and whisker plots, and Grace had this question, how do you know which one is L1, which one is L2? I'm almost positive that the L1, because that's plot 1, that's the one that, or that's, they always put the L1 on the top, the L2 on the bottom, or whichever one you have in plot 1 would appear on the top, plot 2 would appear on the bottom. Otherwise, what you look at is you look at both of their left ends. Notice this is along an x-axis, so this top one, that has the minimum value overall, so that must be the Chase Meadows, because that 42 is, or actually the 23, is the lowest value if you compare all of the numbers. So you should be able to, one way or another, figure out which one is which. So in looking at these two, I guess, would you say L1, would you say the Chase Meadows, would you say that is symmetric or is it skewed? Looks pretty symmetric. And remember, symmetric doesn't have to be, you know, it's exactly, that median is exactly in the middle. Because in some cases, I've had some arguments with this one. If you look at it closely enough and long enough, it starts to look like maybe that median is over on the right side a little bit, but I would say it's pretty symmetric as well. What about L2, the Eden Estates? Would you say that's symmetric or skewed? You'd say this bottom one is skewed? Is that what you said, Julie? Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so that one, again, I'd say if you look closely enough, maybe you could say it looks a little bit skewed. I would say these, if you're kind of going back and forth like, it could be symmetric, it could look a little bit skewed, I would lean towards describing it as symmetric. Because otherwise, really, for all of them, you could say, oh yeah, it looks a little bit skewed here because of this. So I would say if you're questioning if it's symmetric or skewed, I would lean towards the symmetric side. Turn my back on. So I would say for part A, I know it says to sketch. If you want to sketch this on your sheet, that's fine. I'm just going to write up here. Describe the shape. I would say both distributions are symmetric. Otherwise, if I was saying one of them was skewed, I'd want to then say Chase Meadows is symmetric, but Eaton Estates is positively skewed, or if I was saying it that way. In this case, we're saying both are symmetric. So then for part B, if we're comparing the measures of center and spread, do we want to use the means and standard deviations, or do we want to use the 5-number summaries? Means and standard deviations. So for the justification, I'd say since both are symmetric, I'll put compare the means and standard deviations. And then I have to find both. All right, so then to find both, and I'm going to list here, I'll put Chase Meadows. We're finding the mean and the standard deviation, and then I'll do the same thing for the Eaton Estates. I will say there's probably 2 different ways you could do this, and I'll explain why. So in order to get these values, you want to take a look up here. So we're going to that same place of going to the stat, the calculate, and then we want the variable stats to get all of those values so we can figure out what we need. So I'm going to go to stat, and then arrow over once to the right to be under the calculate menu. Here's the 2 different ways you could do this. One way would be to choose the 1 variable stats, but you'd have to specify, you'd have to actually do that twice. You'd have to specify once that you want L1, and then you'd have to do it again and specify you want L2. Or you could do option 2, which is 2 variable stats. So I'm going to actually choose option 2. If you have a screen that looks like this, you should make sure, like mine was already filled in correctly, you should make sure one of your lists says L1, the other list says L2. Notice L1, which was my Chase Meadows, is going to appear as the variable X, and then Eaton Estates, which was L2, is going to appear as the variable Y. And then I can go down and hit calculate. And so it'll give me all of the information for Chase Meadows first. Notice that variable is X. But then afterwards, after you see the N equals 15, I get the stats for the Y. And then actually I get the min for X. So here you just have to pay close attention to the X and Y. And actually, now that I'm looking at this, if we needed 5-number summaries, we'd want to do the other way around, because this doesn't give the quartiles. It just gives the min and the max. Now that I look at this closer. So this would be fine for our purposes. So actually what I might have you do, I'm going to backtrack here, not have you use that. I'm going to have you go to stat, arrow over to calculate, do the 1 variable stats, because if you needed the 5-number summaries, you would have to use the 1 variable stats and do that twice to get your full quartiles. I know we don't need them for this one, but that's what you'd have to do if you needed them. So click option 1 for 1 variable stats. Make sure this says L1. So this would be the information for Chase Meadows, and I'm just curious if you have the black cover for your calculator. If you just hit enter, do you get these values?
Yeah.
You did? Okay. I think when you want from list 2, though, you actually have to specify list 2. I'll show you guys how to do that. So this would be the information for the Chase Meadows. So our mean, again, is the X bar. So I would round that. I'll say 2 decimal places, so 64.27. And then standard deviation. So again, we have to choose if we want the SX or the sigma X. Since we were told this was a sample, do we want the S or the sigma? The S for the sample, so 22.54. All right, and then for the Eaton Estates, I'm just going to clear this here. And this is going to affect whatever calculator you have. You're going to have to type something in. So go to Stat again, arrow over to the Calculate menu, hit Option 1 again for the one variable stats. Where it says List, though, I now want to change this to L2. And even if you have a black cover calculator, I know on your calculator it just says one variable stats and then you have your cursor. You actually need to type L2 after that, or the name of the list of your second list. And again, to get L2, you just hit second and then the number 2, and L2 should appear. So even with the black calculators, make sure after you press enter for one variable stats, type in L2 after it and then hit enter, so that you should get the stats for the Eaton Estates. And let me know whatever calculator you have. Your mean should be 117.8. Let me know if you're not getting that. No matter what calculator you have. Did you get that? Okay. So even with those black covered calculators, you can just type the list in afterwards. So this mean is 117.8. So we still have a sample, so we want the S for the standard deviation, so about 41.94. Okay, and then if we truly were to compare, and I'll just kind of summarize this. I know we're done shortly because it's a Wednesday, we have a shorter class. But if we were to compare this, the standard deviations, again, notice the standard deviation for Chase Meadows is lower. That means the data for Chase Meadows is less spread out. Those data values themselves are closer together. That makes the mean for Chase Meadows a more accurate representation than the mean for Eaton Estates. The farther spread out your data is, the less accurate the statistics become. So I'm not saying we could get a more accurate representation for Eaton Estates, but this is showing if we really compared the two, the Chase Meadows has more accurate data because of the smaller standard deviation. Okay, so just so you understand that too, and if you wanted to make a note, because these are your notes to use as you look back on, I'm really going to stress as we talk about standard deviation, I want you to really understand what the standard deviation represents, what it means, in case you have to explain that on an assessment as well. Okay, so what I need you to do, because we're done, yes, in a minute here, we didn't get to example 4, that's fine. Make sure your calculators are turned off. So again, second on turns it off. Put the covers back on. Please have somebody bring your calculators back over.